Welcome to all of you to this Sunday at the Abbey presentation. Wow, Earth to John. Come in, please. This year, with all that's happening in our country around issues of settling refugees and immigration, and just the rapidly changing culture and demographic within our nation and in our state and region, we thought it was a reasonable thing to do was to put together a series on that topic. So the overall theme for this series this year has been welcomed or not so much, immigrating into Minnesota culture today. This evening we are indeed thrilled and pleased to welcome Miss Diana Elhard, a CSB 2016 graduate. She had a major in political science when she was here. She was an active member of the Eugene McCarthy Center for Public Policy and a student coordinator for many of the events that faculty and visitors, as well as monks and others, came to over those years. She was also a trustee scholar, a Marie and Robert Jackson Fellow, as well as a John Brandel scholar. Since her graduation, she's been actively involved as a refugee resettlement case manager with Catholic Charities in the Twin Cities. So she has seen this issue up close and personal. As of January of this year, Diana has taken a position in the office of Minnesota Senator Scott Dibble as a legislative assistant. This brings her closer to the formulation of policy, which is, I think, the matter that is most dear to her heart. Please give a warm Collegeville welcome to Diana Elhard.
Well, thank you, Abbott Klassen, and everybody else who helped me with tech stuff, Nick Crowley and Brother Paul Vincent. It was kind of some back and forth through email, so I really appreciate it, and being invited back is always wonderful. I lived not far away in St. Cloud when I was growing up, and so my parents also appreciate it because they got to see me when I come back. You said most of what I was going to say about my experience. The one thing I would add is, so I grew up in St. Cloud, and I worked and volunteered a lot with the refugee and immigrant populations. There's a variety of them, all through my childhood and then into college, and worked with refugees and immigrants abroad a little bit as well. I spent a summer teaching English to some folks, and then when I came back to Minnesota, that was the Brandel Scholarship. When I came back to Minnesota, then I got certified through the Minnesota Literacy Council to tutor adults in English education. So that's kind of, I've worked with children and adults who are refugees after they'd been resettled, and I figured the only piece that was missing was that initial on-the-ground resettlement. So thank you so much, and very excited to get into it. So we're going to talk a little bit. When Abbot John called, actually, he asked me to talk about immigration policy, and I was like, well, am I teaching like a semester-long course, because this is a huge thing? And then my follow-up was kind of, I also really only know about the refugee side of things. Because of that, I know a lot about how it's different from other immigrant perspectives, but I don't know a ton about those perspectives. So I'm going to start by talking about some of those differences right at the beginning, and then we're going to do kind of a fact versus fiction based on a lot of common things you hear about how the process works, how the policies outlined and implemented, and then we're going to actually talk about really only one piece of policy, but it is the foundational piece for the system we have today. And I'm going to try and leave you with at least a few things you can do if you feel so moved to change the way this works. So, refugees have an international legal definition of who counts as a refugee. It is, I did not put it in here because it's kind of lengthy, but essentially you have to be able to prove that you have been persecuted on the basis of your identity. So maybe your sexual orientation, your participation in a political group, your ethnicity, a certain race, a certain religion. Maybe you're on the losing side of a civil war and there's some ethnic cleansing going on, things like that. And then that's the UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees definition, is all of those kinds of groups. And then the United States Refugee Admissions Program, which is USRAP, has their own kind of way of dealing with people who fall under that larger umbrella of the UN definition. And we get all these specialized programs. So Congress, a couple decades ago, was like, well, Iranian Christians should have their own segmented program. So now we have a program for them, but it's under the umbrella of the United States Refugee Admission Program, the USRAP program, and it's just like a specialized program. And there are a lot of them, and a lot of them have sunset provisions, so maybe it only lasts for 5 or 10 years. Congress can renew it, or it can end. There's all kinds of wiggle room in there, but we call all of them refugees, and they would all come to an office like I used to work at for Catholic Charities of St. Paul, Minneapolis. We have asylum seekers who, once granted asylum, are then kind of referred to as refugees and lumped into the same program. But essentially, that's folks who, they come, you can imagine a situation where maybe someone, this happened several summers ago, where maybe a child whose family's life is threatened in a South or Central American country comes on up to the border in Texas maybe, and walks across and says, I want to, my life is threatened. They announce themselves to the authorities, and they say they want to file for asylum. Sometimes, if the process is followed as it's supposed to be, that person then gets a court date, and they get a chance to kind of prove that they meet this definition and kind of the program requirements. And if their asylum case is granted, then they go into the refugee program. So last summer, my office got a call in St. Paul saying, hi, my name is Daniel, and I was just granted asylum, and they told me you could help me. We were like, oh, okay, Daniel, where'd you come from? What's your name? What's your date of arrival? These sorts of things. And he was like, well, I've been here for 6 years, and I got a graduate degree. And he came on a student visa and identified as a member of the LGBTQ community in a country where his life was threatened because of that sexual orientation. And so he didn't feel like he could return home, and his case was proven and granted. So because of the life-threatening circumstances, should he return home, he was granted stay. But it's kind of like the programs I offered to initial refugees would not necessarily do him, like I could enroll him in English class, but he did that. I could help him enroll in school, but he had a graduate. So we kind of were like, well, we don't really know what to, so sometimes asylum seekers, they get lumped in with refugees, but a lot of times their cases are, every person's life is unique, but asylum seekers are even very differentiated from one another. Then there's a lot of different other groups that don't fall into those categories, and we kind of are just like immigrants, but there's so many programs. I have listed a couple, not gonna go too in-depth, just listed a couple we've been hearing a lot about recently in current events in the news. The diversity lottery, roughly 50,000 people a year can come from countries that we don't already see a lot of migration from. There's a specialized program where you're not really considered a refugee, but you get different status than, say, a job-sponsored migrant, where if you have been brought here and you're a foreign national and you're trafficked, then there's different, you basically can have a visa for up to 4 years to renew and try and figure out your life from that horrible situation. And then, of course, there are people who are not in any sort of structured program, and we call them undocumented people. And then within that, there are people who sometimes Congress does this weird thing, or presidents do this weird thing where they're like, we're going to make a program for people who don't fit that category either, and that's the situation a lot of the DACA recipients are in, is they came as undocumented and they belong to that category for a long time, but then they chose to be documented, and as I'm sure some of you might have heard in the news, that program's in limbo. And this is kind of why I've said, like, I don't know a lot about immigration law, because I'm sure you all could go to like a 2-hour talk just on the ramifications coming up on DACA, but I do not know a lot about that. I know some Bennies and Johnnies who do, so if you have questions about that or any of those sort of other broad immigration questions, I can give you their contact information because for whatever reason, there's a strong Benny Johnny community around migration and refugees in the cities. I know, I think 4 other folks, so if you want to chat with them, I can pass on their information. So fact or fiction? I hear this a lot, that immigrants want to come to the United States of America for economic gain. This is this is sometimes true, but mostly not true. It's mostly a fictional statement. Pretty much the only group of migrants that we would consider truly economic migrants are people who come here for a job. So let's say there's a really specialized doctor who comes because he can get a job here, or she can get a job here, or there's a professor or a researcher in a great field who comes here, and it's purely, I got a job offer, I'm moving. That kind of is what we would call an economic migrant. Really, I did my honors thesis on some of this stuff and just a lot of different ways to define this, but ultimately it comes from you're moving, the basis for your move is a job, not even necessarily massive financial profit, it's really job-based. There are a lot of people who come. I knew someone when I was a Benny, she graduated a few years before me, who came on the diversity lottery system, who used it to go to school. That was her primary motivation. I'm sure that getting that education has helped her out financially, but I wouldn't ever say that that's purely economic gain. It's more about that higher goal of learning and bettering yourself and having those passions. A lot of people come for family reasons. Actually, more than half of people who come every year to our country in some sort of migration program come for family reasons. Fiancé visas, children of citizens who maybe had dual citizenship or never claimed US citizenship who then decide to, things like that. And this is one of my kind of favorite quips when people tell me, oh, well, they're just coming here because they want more money. Most immigrants, anyone who's not a refugee does not, I shouldn't say anyone who's not a refugee, but most people in most of the migration programs that I talked about and didn't name are ineligible for any county, state, or federal assistance programs for between 5 and 10 years when they arrive. And that is because the way the migration program is set up, there's its language where no additional burden to the state. And so if you come on a fiancé visa or you're sponsoring a member of your family and you are a US citizen who did not come as a refugee, you came for a job and then you wanted to bring other folks with you and maybe your employer didn't sponsor them. Eventually, when you get through the paperwork process and they finally get to come, you have to say that you will help them out financially for that set amount of time. So let's say I came and then maybe 3 years later, we'd fallen on hard times, maybe it was 2008 and our home was foreclosed, we lost our jobs, whatever. If I had been the sponsored person and I went to enroll in food assistance or cash assistance, I would be denied on the basis of my status. The last thing is, this is pertaining primarily to refugees. Refugees arrive in the United States in debt, which is never talked about. That was something I actually did not know until about 2 months before I started working as a resettlement case manager. So we being the United States government, gives everyone loans they sign for on an English document where if they can't spell their name, they have to put their thumbprint. And what they're really saying is they're gonna pay us on average, tickets run about $1,200. They're like, yep, I'm gonna pay that back. And most people have no idea. And so then when I welcome them, it's my job within 5 days, not business days, but calendar days, it was my job, to remind them that they have this legal obligation of debt to the United States government, and that if they don't pay it after a certain amount of time, or if their payments are delayed, just like a regular loan, their credit score tanks, the government could come after them for this money after 5 years, and it's really scary to say, hi, welcome to the US also, you owe us money. So your average family of 5 would be around $6,000 in debt the second they step on the plane to come here. They do not get that much money from us to resettle here, certainly. We do not help them out in that. So they are just in debt, and often don't have jobs. I also hear this a lot, that the United Nations places refugees in the United States. I would say this one's very not true. The other one, I was like, oh, there are actually some people who come for jobs, not refugees, but other people. This one is just flat out not true. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees runs the refugee application process, and they are kind of the international governing body for this whole process. But once a refugee has applied, the UNHCR kind of filters out the group that they think, based on past precedent, the United States will accept. And so they say, this is the pool of people we think you will welcome. And then the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security whittle it down even farther. They go, okay, that's nice. We're going to actually look into this many of those people. There's not exact numbers here because it changes all the time, but essentially there's 22.5 million people, I think, I looked this up. There's 22.5 million people right now who qualify for refugee status in the world. Of those people, probably less than 500,000 are ever in this process at any time, and certainly the Department of State is considering only, around the world, a couple thousand at a time that it's actually looking into. And so all of these agencies, the counterterrorism, so it doesn't really matter, but the first seal is counterterrorism, the second is FBI, Homeland Security, Department of State, and then the Department of Defense. This is not all of the people who make sure that pool of selected few meet security clearances and things like that, but this is kind of the first round. So if you make it through this, then you go through security interviews, a biometric checks, you get your eyeball scan, your fingerprints done. You go through 9 different databases of international, Interpol is probably the most commonly heard of one, but there's 9 different global databases of crime, people who are wanted for various levels of things, and you're run through there. And then you make it through that. Nonprofit agencies partner with the Department of State to actually deliver the services. So that's where I came in, was my VOLAG. It's a super great acronym, but it stands for Voluntary Agency. So VOL, Voluntary Agency. Mine was USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and they have affiliates all over the country. 2 are fairly obvious. One is St. Cloud has a Catholic Charities office. They do not do resettlement. And then there's one in the Twin Cities that does, and also one in Winona, I believe, that does it. So there's 2 out of the 3 that I just named that actually do resettlement, and those are the only 2 Catholic Charities sites here that do it. But so how that would work is every Wednesday there is a meeting. Last year I think there were 9 VOLAGs nationally, and they each have a representative that sits in on a conference call every Wednesday, and they go through the pool of people who have passed all of these checks, and then they say, okay, we'll take that family, oh, we want that family, and they divvy them up. That's it. And then those agencies pass them on to their affiliates in the actual states. So that's, we get an email that says this is the family that's going to come, and it gives us all of the paperwork that's been collecting for the years that they've been going on in this process. And then I get to know everything about them. Sometimes a little bit of information where I'm like, gosh, I hope no one ever knew all of that about me. That wasn't me. But it's like we get to know these people through paperwork really well. Sometimes the answer to certain family matters, sometimes just like a lot of biographical information. But anyways, so that's really how they get placed here. It's really, really heavy on our federal government. And then it's these agencies who contract with the State Department who actually help deliver services. But by no means is the United Nations making a final say on how any of these people get here. Immigrants are a drain on our community's resources. This is also what I would say not true. Immigrants have an overwhelming positive economic impact. I'm hoping that's not new information, but sometimes it is. And particularly the service industry and the agricultural industry, this is not just refugees, but migrants of any sort, not tend to, but a lot of these industries rely on immigrant labor as employees to get things. I made the joke to my parents earlier that the reason you can buy a pint of blueberries at the store in February for only $4 is probably because someone, perhaps not always, I don't want to say like this is always the case, but perhaps someone who is a migrant worker, which is a whole nother system of program we have, or people who were foreign-born who are now here are being paid minimum wage to go to the west of our country and do that work. Again, not always, but sometimes. In Minnesota, it's more service industries where we see kind of the pillars of some of the foundational levels of our economy. These folks tend to go into those industries. So this graph, some of you might not be able to read the words, but the farthest right pillar for you all is foreign-born non-citizens. So once you are in the US for 5 years, depending on what type of immigration status you had, you can apply to become a US citizen. So foreign-born non-citizens presumably are people who have been here for less than that amount of time, but not necessarily. These data were taken from the US Census Bureau in 2016, and you can see that production, transit, and service industry occupations of the foreign-born people, almost half of them are employed in those sorts of industries. And you can see, as we get to being foreign-born who are citizens, the middle column, those numbers change a little bit. And like I said, by no means is this everyone who's an immigrant works in a service industry. No. Like you can see 30% of them are in management, business, science, arts. Like there is diversity in terms of what they're doing. It's just important to realize that the native-born population, 15% of us in Minnesota are employed in service occupations. And for the foreign-born non-citizens, it's almost 25%. And so there's a big difference there. Additionally, refugees and immigrants pay taxes right when they get here. So when I go, the first day a family is here, and I would go with them to the grocery store, we pay tax, sales tax. The first job they get, they will absolutely pay income tax. They file taxes. And so there's this figure that within 10 years, the average refugee has paid back what they were given and then some, just in terms of taxes to their community. And that's state and federal. I don't know the exact divvy on that, but absolutely. Again, it's like anything, it takes a little bit of time. Takes 10 years, but it's given back and then some. Now we're going to get into the Refugee Act of 1980. So this act really set up the refugee arrival system that we know that I've been talking a little bit about. And it set this cap. We've heard a lot in the last year about this cap on refugees. And this act was passed by Congress, and it allowed the president almost complete discretion, although it does say with proper consultation, to determine if that cap can be raised. So when this act was initiated, it said for the years 1980, 81, and 82, refugee arrivals shall not exceed 50,000 people. It said, given proper consultation, given the state of the global humanitarian crises and the U.S. interests in the world, the president may raise that cap. And so for me, I started my job, I was hired about a month before the 2016 election. And so for most of the time I was working there, we knew that there might be a change in this cap and that it would probably go down because the Obama administration, which was just going out of office, had set it at 100,000. And the new administration on the campaign trail, President Trump, at that time, candidate Trump had talked about lowering this. And certainly then President-elect Trump said he was going to do that, and then President Trump did that. And so right now the cap for this year is 45,000 people. I'm not sure what the consultation process is laid out in the law. I'm not sure what was taken. I never asked, and that's really fine with me. It's pretty much up to the president. Additionally, the president can say we want 15,000 people from this region or that region, and we want maybe 10 left over, 10,000 that we don't allocate specifically based on region. And that's because you want to leave some unallocated, which is weird to think about a number for a person to come here is unallocated, but bear with me for that. This law also established the process for spouse and children to come over. So if if someone applies for refugee status, they're granted it. They make it all the way through the process. They arrive here. They can then apply for their spouse and child to come. The year that they come, they're ticked off from whatever that cap is. So those people count into that number that is the cap, if that makes sense. They count as refugee arrivals, even though they themselves might never have actually filed a refugee application. So that's if you have 10,000 that are unallocated to a specific region, then all of those spouses and children can kind of come from that instead of taking away from the initial arrival number from wherever they were coming from. This act also sets up the current asylum process. So what we talked about at the beginning was set up in here. And this act has really, really clear program goals. This act it should be based on and benefit United States interests, not really ever defined. So it does mention in the intro to the statute language that the United States has an ethical and moral obligation to participate because there are so many humanitarian crises around the world, and that it should be our global involvement in the world should kind of be considered and what our interests are. Again, interest is never really defined. And so that, I think, I'm going to show you a graph, how I have kind of thought about it. But it's really purely about the United States interests and also economic self-sufficiency. The refugee program, the goal of the program, when I got into the work, I was like, this will be great. I've worked with refugees and immigrants so long. I can't wait to meet people and welcome them and help them build lives here. No, my contract for USCCB through the State Department is to get people jobs. And it's not necessarily good paying jobs. It can be overnight jobs, second and third shift jobs. It can be at the detriment to their English language education. It doesn't matter. The program goal is within the first 90 days of arrival to get people into jobs. That's it. If you're over 18, that is the goal. Very clear, very cut and dry. That's not necessarily good or bad. But another thing I often hear is, well, why don't people know English? I can tell you, because the goal of the program is not to help people learn English. The goal of the program is to have people get a job. And if job conflicts with the English language class schedule, you have to go to work. Like, you can't miss work to go learn English. Your employer doesn't care. They'll find someone else to take that spot. So that's something that I think is really important when we're thinking about the United States refugee program. The goal of the program, it's stated as economic self-sufficiency, but the report I had to fill out at the end of every 90 days asked, when did they get employment? What hours did they work? How many hours a week did they work? How much were they making? How many people are in their family? What was their rent? Were they able to pay their rent? If not, was a family or friend helping them out? Not, were they connected to social services to help them with their mental health and maybe trauma they've experienced because they've lived through really horrible things? Not, did they find a cultural community or a faith community that can help them and support them socially? Or, through their spirituality? None of that. That was not it. I'll leave that point. But I just think that that's really interesting and really not talked about. And it stems a lot of these questions that you commonly hear stem from, we get what we designed the program for, and we've designed the program to get people into work, pure and simple. U.S. interests, I said I was going to show you a graph. This is like my favorite graph. I found this graph at work one day, and I think my coworkers and I talked about it for 3 hours. It is really hard to read again. So from left to right, it is situated by geographic region, and then from left to right, they appear in the graph top down. So on the farthest left is Africa, which is a blue that would be on top, and then Asia is red. Europe would be a purpley blue right below red. Green is the former Soviet Union. Yellow, there's one yellow, and it's in 1999, and it's Kosovo. And then under that, Latin America, and then under that, it's Near East, but really it's what we'd call the Middle East for the sake of continuity The graph is from 1975 to present, and we didn't really use the term Middle East necessarily the same way until recently. So for main purposes, the farthest right part of the graph that appears light pink is primarily Middle Eastern arrivals or Arab people. I think this is fascinating because if you look from the 70s through the 80s, we're arriving people from Asia because we were really heavily involved in Southeast Asia, right? And then from the early 90s until the very early 2000s, we're predominantly resettling foreign Soviet Union nationals, and a little bit towards the end of the 90s, European nationals. And then in 2001 and 2002, there's a massive drop-off. And then you see a rise in Middle Eastern arrivals. And it's not necessarily, I mean, this is an assumption on my part, but I think it would be remiss to not notice the connection to our conflicts, whether, I guess you'd say hot or cold, in the world and the relationship to where people are coming from when they're coming to our countries. And that also, I think it's important to mention, sometimes because of our involvement in other countries, people who have aided our military can no longer live where they are from. You'll notice I talked about at the beginning, the UNHCR definition of refugee can include political identity or participation. And so this is where, we talk a lot about the first family to ever come to Minnesota was a Hmong family as a refugee family. And the Hmong people really helped our military out. But because of that, when we had to withdraw from that conflict that we were not doing well in, it put them at great risk. And so there was a lot of negotiation. I mean, ask anyone, it wasn't easy to get the US to agree to welcome those people. And for a while they felt forgotten, but eventually we did open up a program to welcome them. And similarly in the Soviet Union, people who were very outspoken against communism or the Soviet regime, we were open arms. Yeah, come on over, we'll show you how great we are, right? And so there's this correlation that I think exists. We talked a little about the role of the president, but I really want to underscore how great of a role that is and how Congress can choose. They have historically carved out spaces for people who are maybe not included in that the president's vision. So there are specific programs for certain minorities, whether it's ethnic or religious or from certain countries, and Congress has that power. But ultimately, the president sets the cap. The role of federal agencies. This is something where I've had a number of people talk to me about, well, none of the executive orders went through, so you're arriving people, right? Well, not necessarily. So those agencies we talked about at the beginning, I put those 5 logos on there. The president gets to choose the head of all of those agencies if someone resigns. And the Department of State has been on a hiring freeze, and the Department of Homeland Security in some divisions is not necessarily hiring people. And so that means interviews that are scheduled don't get conducted because there aren't enough people to do it. People who would be in this screening process or doing the background checks, or who are heads of some of these programs in the Department of State, if they leave, that's not being necessarily replaced. And USCIS, or United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, has a totally different mandate for how to work with people on the ground. And so we took this really nice pipeline of an idea, and we drilled holes all over it. And so even though the cap has been fought in courts and changing it and who can come and who can't come based on their national origin, essentially the effect of the executive orders from last January and February, the effect of them has been the same because people aren't coming. There was one day at work where I got to call 27 families and tell them that their loved ones they had been expecting who already had flights scheduled would not be arriving. 27 families. That is something that is horrible for those families because they expect it to be happening and they're confused. They're like, we've waited years. Why did they do something wrong? Did they commit a crime? Did they do something they weren't supposed to do? No. Well, why aren't they coming? I don't have a good answer for you, right? Because this system that's supposed to work, that we thought was working, we've taken bits and pieces from it. And so there's a lot of actors at play here, but it's kind of like maybe one person can fall out. Maybe 2 agencies can fall out. But if the whole thing starts to deteriorate, executive order, law change, changing the cap number to 45, I will be incredibly surprised if we get more than 30,000 refugees in the United States resettled this year. It just isn't likely because they quite literally don't have the capacity to be doing the process that we have in place. Additionally, you get the role of the voluntary agencies. The voluntary agencies, and this is another often talked about thing, like, oh, well, they make a lot of money by resettling refugees. We make $950 for each person that is resettled. That's accurate, but that also has to pay salary, building, lights, mileage, any supplies, like if there's a family that has a car seat or needs a car seat for a small child, they certainly don't have the ability to pay for that. So we kind of assume that, and we'll either loan it to them for the resettlement period, or in some cases where families are really desperate, we'll give it to them, and then sometimes we can use donations for that, but not always. And so there's this extra strain on voluntary agencies because when you have less people coming, the program that already was a net loss becomes a complete net drain of your financial resources because you don't want to fire your people because you don't know when you might get a ton of refugees back. There's really no predictability in the system. And so nonprofits and these voluntary agencies are really, really struggling. There was one voluntary agency that announced that they were closing 10 offices around our country purely because they just aren't resettling enough people anymore. And so then, even if we fix the pipeline problem and, okay, people can get through and they can get here, if we have not enough agencies to pick up those people, then there's a backlog. Yeah, you're cleared to come, but we don't have anyone to resettle you. Nobody's doing it. An additional problem with that is your security clearances expire every 6 months. So if people don't come and then their security expires, they get put back in line for that security check. And if while they're waiting for that security check, another one expires, and so on and so on. And so that's where we had one case at Catholic Charities when I was there that it was a woman who had waited. All of her children have come, and they're refugees, but she kept either expiring. They also won't let you come if you have a newborn. Your newborn has to be a certain age before you can come. And so she kept having children, and then your children age out of your case once they're over between 18 and 21. They start moving off of your case, and then they have to get their own refugee number, an application, and all of that. So all of her children have come, and she's still waiting to come. And she's been waiting for 23 years in a refugee camp. And she was scheduled for a flight the week after the president was inaugurated. And I had to cancel her flight, or at least tell the family. And those are the sorts of things where, sure, when the process is working well, it takes 12 to 18 months to arrive a refugee. Absolutely. The process never works like that. It just doesn't. It's just how it works. The average family we worked with waited between 8 and 9 years from when they fled their home to getting to the point where they first had a flight assigned. And right now, if you get a flight assigned, it doesn't really mean anything because you still might not come to the country. And so that's like a very, very hard thing, but it all plays into this. If there isn't predictability in the system will fall apart. And so these voluntary agencies are cutting staff and are closing offices, and it's just creating a bigger backlog. So state participation, how does Minnesota fit into all this crazy stuff going on at the federal and national level? So I want to really actually call out, I'm from St. Cloud. I came back a lot last fall. My boss was very generous, letting me leave a little early on Mondays sometimes to drive back for city council meetings. And a member of the city council really likes to say that we can opt out of the refugee program. And I want to be, yes, you absolutely can, but I would like to clarify a little bit what that means as a state if we opted out of this federal program that's run by the State Department. Right now, we're opted in, And that means we got a Refugee Resettlement Programs Office. We call it RPO. And RPO kind of is the overseer. So for example, one of those people I had to call and tell their family, oh, your flight got canceled. I never told RPO, where we have these forms we're supposed to submit when people arrive. I never submitted it. And I also never told them that that person got canceled. So when they called me the next week and were like, why the heck haven't they been scheduled for their vaccinations yet? What are you doing? And I was like, oh, I'm really sorry they didn't come. I won't do it again. But they're the overseer, right? They make sure that certain public health concerns, because maybe people aren't being vaccinated, like they take care of all that. They're kind of the backup if we miss something on our end. They are there to catch those mistakes. They do quarterly updates. They do a lot of statistics on who's coming, what country they're coming from, what county are they resettled in. I mean, I can tell you that 230 people out of 3,059 that came in the year 2016 were resettled in Stearns County because they help do those numbers. So they're really crucial for numbers, for making sure people are getting the services they need. They also hold what's called consortium meetings, and that's mandated by the contract that those agencies, the voluntary agencies, have with the State Department to have these on an at least quarterly basis. You can have it more. In the case of the Minnesota Refugee Consortium, we have them every other month. So 6 times a year, that's a lie, 5 times a year because we skip one in the summer because most people don't come in July. So, but it happens, it's open to the public, and per this contract that agencies have with the State Department, it dictates who should be there. So it dictates who you have to invite, and then you have to record who attends. You have to invite local government officials, county officials, people who administer county assistance programs, sheriff offices, anyone who works in a refugee resettlement agency. There are 5 in our state. They all have to be invited. You can invite national officials, but that's just a recommendation, so Congress people, things like that. But that's all prescribed, and then the Refugee Programs Office helps do that. That's opting in. That's it. That's all it means, is that you have this office and it does that and it's part of your government. So if we opt out, we just don't get that. We don't not get refugees, we just don't get that structure. It's just gone. And agencies would have to have consortium meetings on their own because it's part of their contract requirement. But that's really, it doesn't mean refugees aren't going to come here. VOLAG affiliate offices, like mine in St. Paul, would still continue to get refugee cases, and we'd place them wherever, if they know someone in the state, we'd place them with that person, and if they don't, we'd find a place close by where we know a landlord who will help us house them. That's actually a different issue, but landlord relationships with refugees is kind of tumultuous given the current social context for being a refugee and just a lot of these notions that come up with that. But anyways, Minnesota opting out of this program does not at all mean that refugees will not arrive in Minnesota. It simply means we're giving up some of the say and some of the oversight to make sure that that happens effectively. Counties also play a role. Like I mentioned, refugees can apply for food assistance. They can do that upon arrival, but oftentimes they don't get access to their electronic benefits card for their food assistance from the county for, I would say on average, between like 7 and 10 days. We're required to help them sign up for it within 5, but oftentimes it doesn't come. So the agency has to help them find, food and immediate assistance of items that they might have to have for their family before that. And then cash assistance, they do qualify for cash assistance. They're one of the only forms of types of immigrants who can, and they can only do that after 30 days of residency. So for example, we had a lot of families who came maybe in August or September, who needed backpacks, who needed all this, and we were like, oh, you don't have any cash to use until then. So we rely a lot on donations to help families get those sorts of things so that they can be ready for school and learning. So direct implications of the last kind of year and the change in administrations for Minnesota, this is the year that I came into, the end of fiscal year 17. It's separated by quarters. First quarter's on the bottom, fourth quarter's on the top, and the fiscal year starts in October, so it's kind of weird. So you have to think the first bar is October to January, October 1st through January 1st. But that is the breakdown. Yellow is Asia, green of some sort is the Middle East or part parts of northeastern Africa, and then red is also Africa, but it's weird. This is how I would break it down at work. It's not a pure geographic breakdown because obviously Eritrea and Ethiopia are in the northern part of Africa as well. But it's a really colorful graph, and there's two predominant colors, and they're yellow and green, and that's pretty clear. This is this year. So in the same time period from October 1st through February of 2016 into 2017, we had 834 arrivals, I believe. And this is that same time period this year, and you'll notice that there's really no predominant color, and there's a whole lot less of them. And so that's really what it means on a whole, the kind of shifting and all this kind of poking holes in agencies, and the way the process is supposed to work is ultimately, I guess what I would say is the president's very much asserted goal to have less people arrive. And from specific countries, here we notice some of the countries that were in the executive orders from early 2017, predominantly maybe Somalia or Iraq in the green colors, are completely diminished. Not gone, but certainly a lot less. So poking holes in the agencies and the way it's supposed to work has clearly gotten to the same goal. And this is just arrivals in Minnesota. This is not the whole country, but that is our direct implications on the ground. When I first talked with Abbott John, he said, maybe you can talk about what would it mean to be all in on immigration reform. And I was like, oh man. So now that I work in an office for an elected official, this is gonna sound hokey and like it doesn't matter, but I do not get that many calls a day. And the person I work for represents almost 60,000 people. And I bet you I get 3 phone calls a day, right? Call your people, even if you think they agree with you, thank them, and say what you specifically you're thanking them for. If you have a suggestion, name it. Don't just say, I don't like this. That's not super helpful. If I get 5 phone calls that say, I don't like this thing, I might mention it. If I get 5 phone calls and there's 2 predominant ideas from them that people think could work from a policy perspective, I might mention that, especially if I have a good conversation with the person, it seems like they really care, right? And it sounds like silly and like it doesn't matter, but it does. There are real people on the other end of those phones, and they will talk with you. And if they don't want to talk with you, it's their job to listen. The other thing I will mention is this matters a lot in the candidate stage of any races. This year's an election year. I'm not going to tell you who to support, but no matter how you feel on this issue, make sure it's coming up at candidate forums. You see someone who knocks on your door, ask them about the things you care about, whether it's immigration, maybe it's not, whatever it is. A lot of politicians, for them, it's out of sight, out of mind. So if you put it there in front of them all the time, no matter what issue you're passionate about, they have to think of an answer. And if it's not something they've thought about before, good, because they should, because they're running for office. And if you're their constituent, they represent you. So that's my little plug for that. But then I want to close really by saying that's something you can do. But another Benny I know really well, who I know it's being recorded, so I don't have permission to share her name, just because I wasn't able to get a hold of her before this. So I didn't want to say her name, but I can certainly read her words. She published this. She's the head of a resettlement office down in the cities. And she wrote this when we were going through that period of cancellations and not knowing really initially. This is a personal reflection she wrote, and I will end on this. It's called A Message for Refugees Still Waiting. Dear refugee, I'm so excited to meet you. Until now, I've only known your name, your birthday, your home country, the languages you speak, your biographical information, simple details that tell nothing of the person you dream of becoming. I've also been told what type of education you have, which family member is anxiously awaiting your arrival here in Minnesota. I've talked to that person too. She's told me how much she's looking forward to seeing you again after all these years. It's been so long. I know how big of an apartment you'll need, and I know how long we'll have to wait at the window for your social security cards to make sure each member of your family gets individually processed. I've thought about what community you will join, where your kids will learn their first English words, and where you might soon be interviewing for a job. I cannot wait to help you see all the wonderful things you will contribute to our little world right here. I cannot wait to know who you are and what gives you joy. But things have gotten harder now. The refugee resettlement process was so predictable, but it has become so much more challenging. There is fear where there once was overwhelming love, and a desire to shut out where there once was a door wide open. I can only imagine how you are feeling as you wonder when or if you will still have the chance to get on an airplane bound for America. I know you are feeling hurt and abandoned once again. I want you to know that I too am sad. I share your anger, your questions, your frustrations. It makes no sense to me that you, who have suffered and lost so much, who have been so strong for so many years, should be made to wait longer for safety. I want to tell you how sorry I am, but if I could talk to you, that would mean you are already here, and by then, we would have so many better things to talk about. So what do we do, those of us who want you to be here? What can we do when we are not the ones who make the rules? Doesn't feel like much, but I'll tell you. We will talk about you to our friends, and even, and especially, to those we don't know, about how you are someone to be welcomed, not feared. We pray. We stand up for you when we hear things that are not true. We tell people who do make the rules that our country is only great when you are here, and that we are missing something special when you are on the other side of that door. We remember that you exist, even though we cannot see you. I don't know when I'll get to meet you, and I cannot make any promises about when that day might come, but know this, we are waiting for you. Your family, your case manager, your neighbors, and your friends, the ones you know and the ones you don't. We are all here, and we are waiting. We are keeping safe the beds you will one day put your children to sleep in, the pots and pans you'll use for dinner and community, and the love we will welcome you with the moment you arrive in Minnesota. For however long it takes, we will wait. We will be here. We will be here, and that I can promise. Your friend.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you. There are mics and questions, observations. Renee, please. Oh, there's a mic behind you.
What's the morale like in, for example, where you were working before and in other offices across the country, as far as you know? Because I would think this is a very sad and difficult time for the people that are working there and who are committed to this idea of open arms to those who need it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not great. It's really, I was sharing with Abbott John before we started that so many people who are doing this work, they're trained as social workers, right? So they want to be doing that stuff I talked about meeting the needs that aren't just economic, right? They want to be caring for the whole person, and they want to be doing that. But that takes so much energy, right? Because not only are we worrying about all the people we know whose paperwork we've gotten, who might not come, we're working with those families to try and maintain hope. We have to help those families when people don't come, right? And then the families we do have might be facing real obstacles that didn't exist before in terms of discrimination, in terms of getting housing, jobs. At school, kids are being bullied, and so there's this strain on providing services is there, and then there's this whole world that the people we're actually working with on the ground don't see, which is all the people we're worried about and wanting to come. And so that is extremely stressful, and a lot of different pressures on people who are really used to caring for others. But it's hard work. Normally, this work is not, I mean, it's a full-time job, but it's a full-time job, like 70 or 80 hours a week, full-time job. These only people, sometimes they don't know someone else here, and so you're quite literally their only support. I always tell the story, I got a call at 2 a.m. From a family, so then I had to hang up and call an interpreter who then called back the family, and I had to take them to the ER, and it was Friday at 2 and I was sleeping. But that's the reality, right? They don't know who to call, and you want to help them, and so you do, and so people stretch themselves thin. And so I'd say it's always stressful work, right? It's always, you're trying to help other people. But I think there's so many extra stressors that it's really hard. It's really hard. Most people who I talk with, there's just constant fears of, am I going to lose my job? Is my agency going to have to let us go? But there's also this sense of it will never get better, right? That for the next 3 years now, and maybe longer after that, depending on, it's so much about executive office discretion that it's really hard for people to plan because they just don't know when and if it's going to get better. And so I think that really is one thing, but that's kind of why I went into policy, is because I think it's got to be better. It's got to be. And I didn't have the time or the capacity when I was in direct service to try and do those other things, to try and make a difference in some way. And a lot of my coworkers, not that they didn't believe it could ever be better, they just don't know how, right? They're like, how would we do that? We can petition people, we can help other people get elected. How do we do that? Like, what is that? Oh my gosh, we can, they just don't know where to start. And so I thought, I think I know. And I had an opportunity presented to me, and I thought, I'm going to go for it because, yeah, it's not good. The morale is it's low. It's joyful, though. I don't want to, it's like when people do arrive and there's the whole family waiting at the airport, and, I had a family, a 7-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy, and the little boy had never met his dad. And that reunion, it's just so joyful. There's just nothing like it in the world. Getting to be a part of that and watch people, it's like, that is so joyful no matter how many times you've seen it, and no matter if it's the only person you're going to welcome in 6 months, it's still, there's no way to not be joyful in that moment. So I think those small things help people carry forward.
I'd like to echo what Diana said about making sure that if you're someone that believes we should be welcoming immigrants and refugees, to make sure that your elected officials and candidates hear that, because they are definitely hearing from the other side.
Yeah.
The other side brings it up all the time, the people who want to slam the door on immigrants and refugees with the most elaborate misinformation and negative stereotypes. And the danger is that the candidates will only hear that, the elected officials will only hear that. So I definitely bring that up in forums, bring that up in individual meetings. And this is at all levels, not only federal elected officials, but federal, state, local, school board, all of these people. City council, all these people at every level. Elected officials and candidates play a role in policy. They also play a role in setting the tone of the dialogue. Yeah. And so please let people know, let those candidates and elected officials know that you believe that we should be true to our ideals and welcome immigrants and refugees.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
I just want to thank you all. I'm from St. Cloud, and we're actually the LSS, my coworker and I are with the LSS resettlement team there, so we're really excited to see all of you here. I wanted to share that we do partner with some of the Bennies and Johnnies out here, particularly in nursing. Cultural Bridges actually had a start of their work was a conversation at our office and us saying, please do what you're doing. So that's really exciting. We also have partnered with Service Learning and some of the other programs out here. So we do want you to know that we are also a local resource. Our offices are in St. Cloud, but there are families coming to St. Joe. We help them move into the housing out here, helping them get their first starts. And so we are constantly looking for people who are interested and engaged and want to find ways to maybe meet that refugee and welcome them themselves, or find other ways that they can engage with families. A lot of times the Metro is held up maybe as the only service agencies that you can reach out through. And I love the Metro. We have an office there too. They're so great. Right. They're awesome. But we do have an office in St. Cloud too. And so some people have found that that's an easier venue to also get some of those connections. So one thing I did want to ask you as another person in resettlement, why the change so quickly? from the direct service into policy? How did that transition happen for you so quickly? And we have lots of concepts. One thing that you generously don't share as detailed is the resettlement program isn't perfect. I will say that on your behalf. It isn't perfect, and we know that as we're in the job as well, but how can we, or what ideas would you have for policies that would be productive at a time like this, that can show the vulnerability of the program and then not have that further become like evidence for why it should be destroyed, right? Like, I don't want that at the end of the day. But what can we say to a congressperson or for policymakers about ways to improve the program, concrete suggestions, anything that's been on your mind about that? And thank you again.
Well, thank you. That is something actually I had heard from current students. I reached out to a couple and was like, hey, I'm going to be back on campus. You want to come? And they were like, oh, I'm working with us. So that's awesome. I'm really glad you're doing that. And I want to echo how much it's important to support those agencies, because really, really, really without volunteer effort, a lot of the things we like to do for families can't happen. And so please consider doing that. So I studied political science, and I always knew I was going to do, I shouldn't say always knew, but when I was thinking about going into case management and when I thought about how that played a role, it was kind of like, I'll do that maybe for 3 to 5 years and then I'll go back to school to do policy. And that was always kind of like, do it, then try and work with it in a really concrete, focusing on policy way. I'll say that the difficulty of the year had a lot to do with it. It also had a lot to do with kind of reading the writing on the wall of how many people were coming to our office and how many people I knew we could afford to employ. And I had been doing campaign work in conjunction with my refugee work, which was not maybe a good thing to be doing. It was a lot of time that I was working, but that really fulfilled me in a different way, feeling like I'm meeting people's needs on the ground every day and trying to help them, but I'm also trying to make it better. And it just got to be a combination of factors, and different opportunity came up. Actually, I left initially my work to go to full-time campaign work, and then someone I used as a reference for that, the person I now work for, who then when he was hiring, it fell into place, right? I applied, and he had just recommended me for a different thing and was like, oh, if you want to do this. And I was like, absolutely, like, that's exactly right. So it was kind of, I'd been thinking about leaving for a while, and then all these factors came together, and it was kind of like, all right. And it ended up that later I learned some information about the capacity of my agency, that ended up being a really good choice for the agency and for me, and I ended up someplace I'm really happy to be, if that makes sense. So that worked out very well. Really concrete policies. I think the first thing is to think about one of the only, I don't want to be coming off as the only benefit to having refugees in a community is economic. That I do not believe that's true, but I believe that a lot of people place stock in that idea. And so I think I'm not hopeful enough to say that because it's the right thing and because people matter, people are going to do the policy thing that respects people and values human rights. And I don't think that that's unfortunately necessarily the world we live in. There are a lot of competing interests and lobbyists and money and corporations. So I think a better way to frame it would be to, instead of saying, oh, we have to get people, we have to check the boxes, right? Like, they have to find housing, we have to enroll them in school, we have to get them to a screening appointment for healthcare, and we have to find people a job and enroll them in English. Done. I wish that it was more about and this would take a lot of effort and people, right, to appropriately do this. But I think we need to, and in Minnesota, the consortium group that meets has been trying to include a mental health piece for a really long time, an assessment to make sure that people go through a screening and then get connected to the services they need. I think that should be mandatory, absolutely, that's happening. You could make the argument that when people would be more economically productive, but I think the argument should be framed in terms of that. And also, it is the right thing to do, right? Like, it is helping these people in a more holistic way. But I don't think you can just make that argument. So I think there's shifts to be made in terms of that. I think the work requirement should be different, longer. I think it would be a policy idea I thought a lot about was, so when I was working at an English school for a summer between my junior and senior year of college, I was teaching, and I saw so many students leave school because after 3 weeks, 4 weeks a month, 5 weeks a month, because they got a job. And you just know that if they've only been in English class for 3 weeks and then they got a job, their mobility in that job is minimal. Not because I'm being like pessimistic, because realistically on the ground, how are they learning the skills to be able to move up, even if they start small? And so for me, I think it would be great to say, especially since that's also one of the number one complaints we get is like, why don't people, I'm like, they're trying so hard on so many levels. But I think prioritizing maybe those sorts of skills before employment, which would be a really hard thing, but I think the return on that would be huge in the end, in terms of what people are able to contribute, how they're able to understand the systems better. But I think some sort of, not necessarily like you have to test out of, but just kind of a requirement of like, you have to go to school for 3 months full time, and then we'll place you in a job. I think that would be great. That would do wonders for families, I think, but that's not how it works. Those are kind of like the two that came to mind really instantly, but I think no matter what, the other hard thing is I'm working for someone at the state level, so they have nothing to do with immigration policy, really. We work a lot with congressional offices, so like I get a lot of calls and I connect people to who can help them, or I connect people to the agencies I used to work with, but I don't, states don't write immigration policy, and it's not how it works. So I think eventually I hope to be in that space where I can have like more crystal clear, like everything I'm learning about policy on the state level is like, everything you don't like about it is that way for a reason, and sometimes you don't get to know that until you're there and it's like, oh, well, this amendment, that amendment, whatever. And I'd love to be that immersed in this sort of issue on a national level to be able to say, okay, that, we can change that, let's do it. But I just am not that close to the process right now, if that makes sense. Yeah, I wish I had like more concrete, like 1, 2, 3, 4, but I'm hoping to learn.
Diana, thank you so much. So I'm sure Diana will field further questions, comments, observations, and shake your hand. Our next Sunday at the Abbey will be on March 18th, the blessing of 28 days in a month. Easy mnemonic, and it'll be Professor Gerald Schlabach from the University of St. Thomas, and he will be reflecting on the theological implications of thinking about immigration. Thank you all so kindly for being here tonight. Thank you. Very important.